Hello, I'm Mary Lee LeBay, and today I want to dispel some myths or misconceptions about past life regression. So, in my three decades of personally, professionally facilitating regressions, and now over 2 decades of instructing other practitioners in guiding people through past life regression, I've come upon a lot of questions and concepts about past life regression that I think I would like to explain or try to dispel for you. So, one is that I hear about a lot of practitioners who take like 45 minutes to put a person into trance in order to achieve a past life regression. So if you've seen any of my previous videos, um, I talk about past life memories being very accessible and that we should be able to remember them without any help at all. So having to put a person into trance for 45 minutes seems a little excessive to me. So sometimes people do have trouble going into a relaxed and focused state of hypnosis. And so we do want to take a little time. Remember, people will be coming into the office, or maybe now that we're doing it over Zoom, but they might be in a state of mind that is not completely focused, right? Because maybe they've been busy with the kids or doing a lot of business and responding to people and having maybe a more stressful day. When they used to come into my office, maybe they've been driving in traffic and their mind has been busy with their worries and concerns. And of course, we want to relax the client and focus their mind and get them to really let go of all that other busyness. But in my experience, I've been able to do that within 10 minutes, 10 minutes at most. Now, with people who are more used to doing the regressions and doing hypnotherapy, maybe they meditate a lot, or somebody who's been coming in to see me many times, and I know how they operate. I know how long I need to continue to do an induction. We're able to go in between 5 and 10 minutes into a plenty deep state that is going to allow them to experience their past lives. The way that I take them in with the induction is really quite specific. Instead of me just talking and talking and talking and going deeper and deeper and relaxing and on and on and on, me talking, I take just a couple of minutes and then the client and I are in discussion and we're in a dialogue and they're describing to me their safe space, for instance, and we're looking at a lot of those details. And then we get an empowerment symbol, and they're getting this specified information that is coming to them, and this specific energy that is bringing them traits and characteristics. And then we go to a sacred healing space that's even different, and they're describing that and putting themselves into that energy. And by the time we get there, which really only takes, 5 to 7 minutes, by the time we get there, I'm able to gauge by their level of engagement how deep into trance they are, how well they're connecting with their right imaginative brain, how they're imagining these different spaces and how focused they are, whether they're visual or they're kinesthetic. I'm getting a lot of feedback of information about my client just from taking them into the induction. And then we get to the hallway and the doorway that I've explained in other videos, that it's just a device that helps us to lead them into a past life. By the time we get to the hallway, I already know that they're deep enough and they're visualizing. And then we go into the past life. So two things. One is it doesn't take 45 minutes to get them into trance. If your session is only an hour, you've used up most of your time. If it's 2 hours, you've used up half of your time. And I just don't think that's the value that people are coming to me and paying me for. If I can get them into trance in 5 to 7 minutes, actually, even that time is very valuable and is eliciting a lot of valuable information. And then we go into the past life, which opens up that whole world, so that the entire time that we're working has been used very, very constructively and gives us a lot of information. So another myth is that when you go into a past life, you have to start here in this moment and go back to your childhood, go back through the womb, go back into the astral between lives, and then go back into a past life, and maybe just the past life that just happened most recently. Well, first of all, that's not how memory works. Our consciousness, our memory, even in our subconscious mind, is not in chronological order. If I ask you, what did you do yesterday? Do you have to start by thinking, well, before I started watching this video, I was having lunch, and before lunch, I was doing this, and before that, I was brushing my teeth and taking a shower, and before that, I was sleeping, and before that was the evening, and all the way to what you did yesterday? That's not how memory works. If I say, what did you do yesterday? You just go, oh yeah, I was gardening yesterday. I was outside. It was great. You don't have to go through that, right? So if I say, what did you do? What was your graduation like? Whatever school you graduated from, high school, college, university. What was graduation like? You don't go, well, let's see, yesterday I was doing this. Last week I was doing this. Then I had a job. Then and you're going back through time, and then, oh yeah, then I graduated. Okay, I remember that day. Doesn't happen that way. So people that are doing that as a regression technique, again, I think it's kind of wasting your time. And they aren't really understanding how memories work. Our memories are in our consciousness, right there in the files. And when we go back to look, we can just pick that file. So I can say, okay, when was I a warrior? And then I can conjure visions of that, different events, maybe fighting in the Civil War, maybe fighting with the Romans, maybe coming across the tundra with Russians or whatever. Those are not my memories. I'm not typically a warrior, but just to give you an idea, we can just go right to those memories. So we don't have to go backwards in time. We don't have to regress slowly. So that's why I use the hallway and the doors, because when you go through the door, the scene is already there. Some people go through the door and they're in the death scene. Some people go through the door and they're just a child. And sometimes you go through the door and it's something in between, right? It could be any memory from any given lifetime. Those memories are out there in a big pool. They're just all out there. Just like all the memories of this life are out there in a big pool, and all you have to do is, think of it. You don't think of your math problems by going through every single math class to figure out how you learned it, or go back in time to the first time you did 2 + 2 is 4, and then it's like, oh yeah, 2 + 2 is 4, right? No, that memory is right there. So that's a myth that I think you'll appreciate. Other things that I've heard is, even if they're using the door, I heard of one instructor that said, or practitioner that said, if you go through the door and you look down and you see you're wearing tennis shoes, you need to come back out of the door because you're in the wrong era. Well, you'd have to think, when were tennis shoes actually created? And I looked it up, and right now I'm not remembering when that was, but it was like before the turn of it was early 1900s, or maybe even before that. Um, so that would mean that you couldn't have had an incarnation. Uh, you couldn't have been born or had a different incarnation in the early 1900s. That's not true unless you're 100 years old, right? So that that kind of thinking, first of all, there's a couple problems with that. First is you could have had a lifetime. I was born in 51, for instance. I could have had a lifetime that ended in 1950, and we had tennis shoes back then, right? Or in 1940s, or even in the 30s or the 20s, there were tennis shoes. If they were playing tennis, there were tennis shoes. Um, so that is a myth that just doesn't even make sense. The other part of that is you might go through and you look down and you say, okay, well, I'm wearing tennis shoes. And then as you're going through the regression, you figure out that those weren't really tennis shoes. They were lace-up shoes that were made of cloth, but they were really something else. And I just mistook them. I thought they were tennis shoes, but really they were moccasins, or they were some other kind of lace-up shoe from some other culture, some other era. But I just wasn't seeing it clearly when I first walked through the door. So whatever somebody sees when they walk through that door, or however they're getting into the regression, whatever they see, we need to just go with it. Because it can change and evolve as we get into that lifetime, and then we can do the corrections then. For instance, I had a client who was having trouble going into the lifetime. He was very vigilant and engineer-like, and he needed some help getting into that more creative, imaginative side of himself. And so I said, well, what era do you think that you might have lived in? And he said, I always thought I was a cowboy. So I said, okay, imagine you're a cowboy. And he said, kind of a high desert plain kind of cowboy. And I said, okay, just imagine that that's who you are, and tell me what's happening. Oh, I'm riding a horse and I'm riding across the prairie. And finally I come upon a covered wagon, and it's tipped over, and there's some skeletons, and there's some trunks with clothes in it. And so I said, okay. And he said, well, I get off my horse and I'm walking around and kind of digging through things and everything. And I said, okay, well, I don't know. Somehow as we were going, we come to a point where I said, well, what are you wearing? And he looks down and he goes, I'm wearing white man pants. And I said, what does that mean? What do you mean? And he goes, white man pants. And he said, I'm really surprised. And I said, why? And he looks at his arm and he goes, I'm an Indian. And so even starting out with this assumption that because he thought he had been a cowboy in a lifetime, as he reverted from his imagination into actual memories, that his conception of that and his assumption of it actually changed and became more accurate. And then he was seeing himself wearing clothes that he didn't expect, and that surprise was actually a pretty good confirmation that he was actually now tapping in to actual memories instead of just making up a story that he thought was happening. So that's actually a good clue when there's emotions coming out or surprises that occur. Then it's a pretty good confirmation of the accuracy of that. So I would rather go with whatever they're experiencing when they start the regression, just kind of flow with it and find out and allow that to take shape. I always think of this lifetime. in my future life, when I come back here, it's going to be a mess. Um, I lived in the 60s, the hippie times, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2020 now we're in, and maybe there'll be a few more decades. The styles have changed. I've lived in the US, in the West. I've lived in Minnesota. I've lived in Ohio. I've lived in Texas. I spent some time in California. I lived in Puerto Rico for 5 years. I've lived in Holland for 2 years. I speak Spanish and English, and for a while I was studying a little bit of Dutch, and hearing Dutch in my environment, right? And German, and I've traveled all over the world, to Asia, to the South Pacific, to Australia, New Zealand, South America, Europe, Russia, um, all over the planet. And so if I jump into a lifetime, it might be pretty confusing in the beginning. I've attended Renaissance festivals, right? So you're all dressed up in costume, or maybe during Halloween, something like that, and you're dressed up. So you can't just take that on face value when you jump into a lifetime and, oh, here I am, I'm dressed up and I'm in this village that seems to be Renaissance. And then all of a sudden it's like, but I feel so modern. Now we're getting in a car and driving away, right? We can't make assumptions about that. We need to just follow those memories and see, what is it that's going on. Maybe you're in the 1920s, and you still remember the 1890s, when you were wearing floor length dresses, and now you're wearing flapper clothes. I think that kind of wraps it up for the myths for now. If I think of any more myths, I'll come back and do another video for you. So thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you in the future.